Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us. My name is Paul Tiao, and I'm the president of Communities United Against Hate. I'll be your moderator today. Before I begin, I need to go over a few technical points. We have about 400 attendees, so only the speakers can be seen and heard. Everyone else is muted and cannot be seen. Please use the Q&A function to post questions and not the chat function. Everyone here today will see your questions. And so if you like someone else's questions, please use your upvote feature to indicate that. Just click on the question and you should be able to vote. I'm gonna do my best to select questions from the audience and pose them to the panelists. I'll prioritize questions that get a lot of upvotes, but please understand that given the number of folks on, I doubt that I'll be able to get to all of them. I also may need to generalize some of your questions into broader topics so that we hit a range of issues. Our speakers might be able to answer a question in writing, but keep in mind that they will be focused on the discussion before us and you might not see your question. So don't get upset if your question doesn't get asked and answered today. We'll do our best. And if anything, just blame me. Anonymous questions will be blocked. The town hall is being recorded and it is open to the press. And for speakers, I just want to remind you to mute yourself when you're not speaking. So I'd like to start by thanking our speakers who are dedicated leaders, decision makers, and activists who are developing and implementing solutions for stopping police brutality and ending racism. I also want to thank our 20 co-sponsoring organizations who represent an incredibly diverse cross-section of the community. They have publicized this event to their networks with the goal of uniting the county to address these very serious problems. Yesterday, George Floyd was buried. All of us here today, our community and our nation continue to mourn his tragic and horrific death at the hands of police officers who were entrusted to protect lives, but instead committed murder. Our collective outrage has fueled thousands of passionate protests around the country and the world. And our nation finally appears to understand the racist, violent reality that the Black community has faced for centuries. As we stand in solidarity against systemic racism and widespread police brutality, we have begun to ask ourselves serious questions about how to fix these problems. Cities, counties, and states have begun to introduce and enact significant reforms. Developing and implementing solutions, though, is tough. It's very difficult. And today, we're very fortunate to have with us speakers who are in a position to create change that will hopefully stop police brutality. First, we'll hear from Maryland Attorney General Brian Frosh, then Montgomery County Police Chief Marcus Jones, and then Montgomery County Sheriff Darren Popkin. This will give us a baseline for what our chief law enforcement officers are doing to address police brutality and racism. I think we may hear solutions such as improving training and procedures to curb the excessive use of force and prevent racial profiling, strengthening authority to remove cops with a history of misconduct, developing working arrangements with mental health professionals, and supporting local or statewide legislation to change the system. From that baseline, from that starting point, our next set of speakers will examine additional potential solutions. County Council members Nancy Navarro and Will Jawando have been leaders against racism and police misconduct for years. They've both passed groundbreaking laws on these issues in the past and have additional reforms that they are developing. And they'll be speaking after the three law enforcement officers. We'll conclude with Christina Roth, who leads Amnesty International USA's criminal justice program, including the Rights Now campaign. And she's been part of a 400 group coalition pushing for federal and state reforms to address police brutality, ICE detention, gun violence, and other related problems. She'll talk about pending bills in Congress and Annapolis. Each speaker will go for about 5 minutes, and we'll answer questions specific to them during their speaking slot. I will bring questions to their attention. We will address general for all the panelists after concluding the opening remarks. Our plan is to have about 45 minutes to spend on Q&A from all of you. My hope is that each of you will come away with a clear understanding of some potential solutions and opportunities for you to engage and create change through advocacy and other means. CUAH will continue to examine potential solutions in future town halls. Our next one will take place during the week of June 22nd with U.S. Senator Chris Van Hollen, State Senator Will Smith, who is the chair of the Judicial Proceedings Committee in the state Senate, and the Silver Spring Justice Coalition and other legislators and activists. This will include a deeper dive into federal and state bills that folks can support, and advocate for. And you'll get a CUAH action alert for that in the coming days. Frosh is Maryland's 46th Attorney General. He is working to ensure fairness, equality, and justice for all Marylanders. Serving as the people's lawyer, Brian is focused on keeping communities safe, on limiting environmental damage from polluters, and on protecting Maryland consumers from fraud and predatory businesses. Under Brian's leadership, Maryland became the first state to issue guidance prohibiting discriminatory profiling by law enforcement. The guidance declares that race, ethnicity, national origin, gender identity, sexual orientation, disability, and religion cannot be factors in routine police activity. He recently sent a letter to Congress requesting the authority to conduct pattern and practice investigations of unconstitutional policing. As Attorney General and with hundreds of lawyers representing the state, Brian thought it was important to implement implicit bias training for all employees within the Office of Attorney General. He also supported legislative efforts to strengthen prosecutions of hate crimes and require law enforcement training in recognizing, reporting, and responding to hate crimes. Mr. Attorney General.
Thank you, Paul, and thank you to everyone, Communities United Against Hate, and everyone listening. I'm honored to be on such a distinguished panel with Council Member Navarro, Sheriff Popkin, Chief Jones, and Christina Roth. It's a pleasure to be with you. I want to say these past few weeks have been awful, very hard for many of us. The stalking and murder of Ahmaud Arbery by literally white vigilantes, the shooting of Breonna Taylor in her own home, and ultimately the death of George Floyd, which we all watched in slow motion, unprovoked, unnecessary, and totally tragic. It's not a surprise that many members of our community have lost trust in law enforcement when they see live on videos these events occurring. We need to act urgently to remedy the injustice of these deaths and countless others. And make no mistake, they are mostly African-American men who suffer, but also all other kinds of people of color. I'm very proud of the work that our office has done. As you said, Paul, one of the first things I did when I was sworn in was to issue guidelines to every law enforcement agency in the state prohibiting racial profiling, discriminatory profiling. And we have required each of our attorneys to take implicit bias training. I think that's extraordinarily important. It's something that has been at the top of my list, namely justice for the poorest among us, for people of color. One of our early initiatives was to get rid of cash bail because we know that we have thousands of people in our prison systems, in our jails, for one reason and one reason only: they're poor. They can't afford to pay the bond that's been set for them by a judge. And the new rule that was passed by the Court of Appeals in connection with our initiative prohibits the use of cash bond except in the very narrowest of circumstances, and our jail populations have declined by thousands, but not enough. When Donald Trump was elected, we saw an upsurge of hate messaging and hate incidents. Our office, because there wasn't another that we were aware of, opened a hate crimes hotline in response to that. And unfortunately, as soon as he was sworn in, Donald Trump issued, among his first executive orders, the Muslim ban. And we, along with attorneys general across the nation, fought back. We sued them, and we've won. We've continued to contest what I believe are racist policies by the Trump administration. The most egregious of them is the policy that separates children from their families when they're brought across the border. I think that's despicable, and thankfully the courts have shut it down, though it goes on, notwithstanding the court orders. We will be rolling out tomorrow, something we had long planned before the death of George Floyd, and that is an access to justice task force that will deal with root causes of poverty and of discrimination against people of color and people as a result of their religion. We have a very distinguished group of people, and you'll read about it tomorrow, hear about it tomorrow, but we have, I think, the best and the brightest from all over the state who will work with us to help eliminate these root causes of hate, root causes of poverty and despair that many of our fellow citizens find themselves tangled up in. And we will continue to work with people like our Councilwoman Nancy Navarro, our legislators in Annapolis, and our congressional representatives to get policies enacted to stamp out injustice, to stamp out intolerance, to stamp out hate, and to give opportunities to people who have been driven down, abused, and discriminated against. I'm often referred to as the chief law enforcement officer in the state, but I can tell you our mission is a much greater one than that. Our mission is justice, and we will continue to do everything in our power to protect Marylanders, to improve their lives, and to deliver justice. Thank you very much. I look forward to your questions.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Attorney General. We next have Montgomery County Police Chief Marcus Jones. Chief Jones was appointed the 17th Police Chief of the Montgomery County Police Department in November of 2019. He's a 34-year veteran of the department and recently served as the Assistant Chief of the Investigative Services Bureau. He also served as the Commander of the 3rd District, the Director of Major Crimes, the Drug Enforcement Commander, and a variety of other assignments. Marcus helped to create an award-winning diversity training program for the police department, which he has taught to numerous academy classes. He has a Bachelor of Science degree in Business Administration from the University of Maryland, University College, and is a graduate of the FBI National Academy and the National Executive Institute. Chief Jones is a member of the Major Cities Chiefs Associations, the Maryland Chiefs Association, and the Police Executive Research Forum, as well as the International Association of Chiefs of Police. Chief Jones, over to you.
So good evening. Thank you, Paul, and thank you to the Communities United Against Hate for inviting me to this very important discussion involving racism, systematic racism, as well as police brutality. It is a very disturbing time that we live in. All my life I have fought and will continue to fight against systematic racism as well as police brutality as we move forward in this struggle. And I will tell you, over the past couple of weeks, I have been beyond angry. I'm just sick to the core of my soul when I saw what happened in Minneapolis to George Floyd. Knowing in law enforcement what our training is, what we are required to do, how we are supposed to be humane in our treatment of any individual that we are arresting for any type of crime. It does not matter that we all are supposed to respect humans to the highest degree. It is what our department, again, trains and we focus on, and it is what all policing in America should be about. And I will tell you that many of my colleagues, my officers from my department, across the professional realm of policing are just upset about this, as you probably have seen over the past few days. I will say that as we look at this, we have to look at ourselves in the mirror in the world of law enforcement to see what are the things that we can do to be better, but most importantly, to gain the trust of the community that expect us to protect and to serve them. As I spoke to a group of protesters at Gaithersburg's Lake Forest Mall on this past Sunday, I noted to them in those two facets of protect and serve, which to me means to be a guardian in the protect realm, and to serve is that we are servants of the people, and that we serve each and every one of you that are on this call tonight. And again, thank you all for being here and listening to us. And I look forward to also answering questions and concerns. And as we have done that over the course of when we say addressing issues such as the protests that occurred over the past probably 8 or 9 days, we've had 57 protests in the county. And I'm very proud of Montgomery County police officers and other law enforcement officers within the state, to include the Sheriff's Department, that have assisted us, that we have done them in a way that has been respectful. We have given folks the ability to express their First Amendment right to free speech, to speak and to march in many of our communities across the county. And the great news for me also is the fact that out of all of those events, they were all peaceful, and there were no arrests that came from any of the events that occurred here in Montgomery County. So that tells me that there are people who are committed to change here in the county. And as we move forward with this, the one thing I want to express is my commitment that I believe that there is police reform that needs to be addressed as we move forward in addressing issues of systematic racism as well as police brutality. As a police chief here in Montgomery County, I have a unique challenge of how I can discipline officers as it relates to any violation, a serious violation such as police brutality. But again, at the end of the day, one thing I will assure you, that I bring all cases of police brutality that come before me. I will make sure those cases are fully investigated in a fair and impartial manner, and that we will proceed against issues that whether it be referred to the state's attorney's office for criminal prosecution, or that we will discipline, and I do and intend and have done so, will discipline officers for violating excessive use of force policies here in the county. And that is something, again, as it relates to accountability, that is most important for you as a community to know that officers will be held accountable when they are found to be in violation of those policies that have been implemented here in the county. And as we move forward, as well as I look at changes, one thing that I promised, and when I was before the county council as for confirmation, I spoke that I was committed to working with we would be moving forward with a racial audit for Montgomery County Police Department. We are going to look, have a deep dive of an independent body that I have on the verge of moving forward. That independent body is going to take a look at all of our practices as it relates to traffic stops and all of this in fair and impartial policing, our treatment of the minority community, and a vast majority of other things that relates to our practices and policies in relation to being fair. And that part of that will include the community to be a part of that. And the police department will not be directing it. It will be an independent audit that will proceed. So these are the things that will give the community a look at what your department is doing, what it needs to do better, where it needs to improve, and how do we go about improving that. And I would hope that those that are partnering with us in order to do police reform would take a minute to pause to really understand that there are things that are in motion that we can do this together if we just work together in a way that's beneficial. And I'll close on this just for the fact that I just want to state that as we look at accountability and how we are holding our officers accountable, one of the things that I'm thankful that the council did a few years back is they approved our officers wearing body-worn camera That to me is very instrumental in allowing us to see a view, the public to see a view of the actions taken by police officers. Each one of our use of forces that are done, reported, and any complaint that comes down, but each one that is, each use of force that is done by our officers in patrol that have body-worn cameras are reviewed by our executive officers. And those reviews are extensive to make sure that they stay within the realm of our policies. And anything that's outside of that policy will be automatically referred to our Internal Affairs Division. That is an absolute under my command. We have not changed the way we do that. We will continue to do that in order to, again, to maintain accountability for Montgomery County Police. So thank you again for the opportunity to be here this evening with my distinguished panel. And I look forward to being able to answer some questions as we move forward. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you very much, Chief Jones. We have a number of questions that are pretty specific to your department. And so I think I'm going to take a few minutes to ask you a couple of questions that have been posed in the Q&A. And I'm going to take these sort of in the order that they came in. One question concerns whether you are looking at methods to de-escalate the use of force in Montgomery County. Could you speak to that question, please, sir?
Absolutely. So, we have for the past few years already implemented some de-escalation techniques in our training academy that we are training all of our recruits that come new to Montgomery County Police, as well as our veteran officers. Each year, our veteran officers go through in-service training, and much of what we focus on that mandatory training is that we implement some de-escalation techniques, as well as some new procedures that we are trying to implement when we have our officers go through the training. I am now exploring, and we're actually probably going to implement it very soon, a new phase of the Police Executive Research Forum just put out called ICAT training, and we will be implementing that training very soon to deal with different cases such as suicide by cop and some more situations that we hope that will help give our officers more tools as we move forward in dealing with different types of situations.
And to pick up on that and then ask another question that came in early, but is a recurring theme. You mentioned suicide by cop. It seems like a significant percentage of cases involving potential violence and during an interaction with police officers involves folks that have mental health issues. There's been a lot of conversation about sort of utilizing social workers and mental health professionals more actively, more directly with police officers side by side to address those challenges. And I think the questions have come in sort of in different ways. Folks talk about sort of reimagining public safety, talking about it more community oriented. But I think a lot of it goes to this question of the appropriate role for police officers and then potential role of mental health professionals and social workers, and potentially providing funding for those types of professionals to assist police officers in certain situations. Could you speak to that issue, please?
Oh, absolutely. I think that is a very important issue. I stated this a couple of days ago, and I think that it's an important issue to remember that the public needs to know. Several years back, and this probably goes back all the way back to the late 80s, where I think that the federal government, as well as some states, really defunded mental health in sort of the investment in the mental health community with hospitals and other types of mental health assistance. And what happened is now, now the police across the country, including Montgomery County, have dealt with mental health issues at a much higher rate than I have seen in my earlier part of my career. And that has been going on for quite some time now. And so while I agree that yes, that there are avenues that would be better served, that there are, social workers or health, mental health specialists that are better served to handle some of these situations. I can tell you there are times when the police department gets called and there's no one else to call in order to address some of these situations. We do have some significant assistance with our mobile crisis team. Our officers are given some mental health training at a basic level, and some have more extensive training for our crisis intervention teams. We'd like to grow that to some degree, but I'd also like to be able to, and I'm exploring some possibilities to have other options to have mental health specialists handle a lot more of the types of calls and be diverted, not that the police would handle them, but that these mental health specialists would actually handle those types of calls. So it is a major issue. And I will tell you that our officers spend an incredibly large amount of time dealing with some mental health calls, and some of our folks who have issues that we are not equipped to address. And so it is no doubt in my mind that I am committed to looking for options that and working with other partners across government in order to better serve the mental health community, for us in policing in many ways to get sort of out of responding to certain types of calls that are not police related.
Great, thank you very much. I would imagine that Council members Navarro and Jawando may have some thoughts on that. We'll return to them in a few minutes. A couple more questions for you, Chief, if you don't mind. There's several questions about the police union and your relationship between your office and the FOP. Questions about how it is, what effect the FOP has on your efforts to discipline officers, and then also questions that I think are related to that concern the law enforcement officers' Bill of Rights and the effect of that on your ability to manage your department. Can you offer your thoughts on some of those issues, please?
So so with the FOP, our union, we have a collective bargaining agreement that has been agreed upon by the county and the FOP through the collective bargaining agreement process. And this has a long history and standing as it relates to what is the disciplinary process based upon the way the county has negotiated this, that gives the chief, me, the power to discipline officers. So where this kind of, there becomes a little bit of controversy, you might state, is the fact that I have, when officers go through a process, I have the ability to propose a discipline, the actual, what is the discipline the officer is to receive. That officer then has the ability to take two routes for if they disagree with the discipline. They can have what they call a traditional hearing board, or they can have an alternate hearing board via the collective bargaining agreement. The traditional hearing board is based under the law enforcement officers' Bill of Rights, which is a piece of legislation out of the state legislature. That is where you would have three officers actually sit on the panel. One of those officers would have the same rank as the officer that is accused. The difference between the alternate hearing board is that you have an officer that the chief selects, an executive officer that sits on the panel. You have an officer selected by the Fraternal Order of Police, the union, and then you have a neutral arbitrator. The neutral arbitrator is a professional arbitrator that both parties agree upon that will hear those cases. And they can, when that panel comes to a decision, and if they do come to a decision, they can override my recommended discipline for that particular case. And so that sometimes can create some issues as it relates to our bargaining agreement. The law enforcement officers Bill of Rights, the LEOBR, again, which is legislated, it doesn't necessarily hamper me from a state of discipline, but it does give officers certain rights that they have. For example, when they're involved in certain situations, they are not compelled to give a statement immediately upon that situation. There are days that they're allowed to confer with legal, with legal attorneys that would then provide them some ample time before they give a statement of involvement about the incident.
Okay, I'm going to ask you one more question, and then we're going to move on to Sheriff Popkin. I'm sure that there's at least 20 more questions that have come in, but I just haven't been able to look at the Q&A while I've been listening to you talk. But as a follow-up to your conversation about the Law Enforcement Officers Bill of Rights, would you support changes in LEOBR in Annapolis in next session?
Well, I think the question is, what changes would that be? Again, I am one that I think that the fairness is important in any process. But I think we look at certain things as it relates to personnel records that I think that police chiefs should have the ability to share, well, I should say disciplinary records, not necessarily all personnel records, but disciplinary records about our officers, that we should be able to share that with the community in response to our officers and their in an accountability way. I know we've tried to push that and support that in years past of changes. So we'll continue to support that as we move forward.
Thank you. And Mr. Attorney General, there was one question that came in for you that was specifically for you. So if I may turn back to you for just this question before we move on to Sheriff Popkin. There's a question about the policy of eliminating cash bail and whether that's been effective. Do you have any thoughts on that, sir?
Yes, it has been effective. It's not as effective as it should be or could be, but it has reduced the jail population across the state by thousands of people per day. And it saves the state money. And of course, it means that these people can go to work. It means that they can take care of their families. And so it's had a very good effect. Now, there are some jurisdictions that aren't using it as much as they probably should. There's some judges who are still imposing cash bail, even for nonviolent crimes, even when you can expect the individual to show up. But it makes economic sense. It makes sense for justice. I mean, just as an example, it costs between $100 and $150 per day to hold someone in jail. Sheriff Popkin is an expert on this. And if we're monitoring them outside of jail, even if they're wearing the most expensive GPS device that's around, it's more like $30 a day. We can do better, we can save money, and we can avoid having these very harmful effects on people who haven't even been convicted of a crime. So it's been a great success.
Thank you, sir. Okay, so and speaking of Sheriff Popkin, let's move on to Sheriff Popkin, folks. When the sheriff was speaking, I'll go back into the Q&A to sort of extract more questions. Sheriff Popkin received his BA degree in law enforcement from the University of Maryland, College Park. Sheriff Popkin, over to you, sir.
Although you froze for the majority of what you said, good things you said about me, I'm sure it was all good. So thank you anyway. I want to thank you and the Communities Against Hate, the incredible work of Moms Demand Action, and all of the other sponsors for the invitation to participate in this important town hall. I want to just start off by thanking the diverse and hardworking staff at the Montgomery County Sheriff's Office, who really at the beginning of any assignment start off with the terms of care and respect before they ever get to protect and serve. And I think the care and respect is incredibly important when you're dealing with the community. When I saw the video of Mr. Floyd's senseless and tragic killing, due to the actions of police officers, really whose primary duty is to protect life. I knew that it would be forever etched in all of our minds and that certain reforms are necessary. Marcus talked about the protests that have been going on in the county for the last 7 to 10 days. And there's been close to 60 protests, and they've all been peaceful. And clearly, I've been at some of them, and the anger and the concern are so justified in really what has been going on. But they have been peaceful, and I commend all of the people who have come out to participate in these. I co-chair the legislative committee for the Maryland Chiefs and Sheriffs, and have been quite immersed in the state legislative process involving public safety related legislation for a number of years now. I got to work with Attorney General Frosch for many years when he was Senator Frosch in charge of the JPR committee. So I've been involved with that. And the legislative committee has been working over at least the last 5 years to strengthen laws around the release of disciplinary records, body-worn camera video, use of force reporting, mandatory de-escalation training, and mental health training, and many, many more. And some of the bills that have been introduced have been successful and made it through, and others we're continuing to try to make, to work on. I know on a local level, both Councilmember Navarro and Councilmember Giwando are definitely doing a lot of those things on a local level, and we're trying to get those things passed on a statewide level as well. I was fortunate to participate during right after the Freddie Gray incident in Baltimore City during the creation of President Obama's 21st Century Policing recommendations. I was invited down to the White House to participate in that. And I will say that those recommendations back in 2015 were very, very timely back then. And I will say 5 years later now in 2020, they are incredibly, equally as timely, if not more now. And if you have never seen this before, I would suggest you Google them and read them, and you'll see how timely that they are now as well, those recommendations. Yeah, and I will say as an example of one of those recommendations, certainly Montgomery County is still the only jurisdiction in Maryland that the state's attorney, John McCarthy in Montgomery County, has reached an agreement with the state's attorney in Howard County to independently review officer-involved shootings. So, and that's one jurisdiction out of 24 that has come to that. And Montgomery County, in a lot of ways, and a lot of times lead the curve on things, but that's the only jurisdiction that has done that. So kudos to Mr. McCarthy and Mr. Gibson, the Howard County State's Attorney, on that. And I'll leave it at there. I'll certainly be available to answer questions. I appreciate the opportunity to be part of this panel and to work towards a lot of reform that we've been working on. Frankly, we've been working on it for years, and we'll continue to try to push those efforts statewide and locally as well. So thank you, Paul.
Great. Thank you very much, Sheriff Popkin. I think, there's a question that has been coming up, and I'm going to sort of raise it with you now and invite Chief Jones to also talk about it. But the Attorney General, in my introduction, we talked about the work that he's done to do implicit bias training throughout his office. And there's a couple questions have come in about implicit bias training. Can you talk about whether, first, Sheriff Popkin, do you do training of that sort in your department? And then after that, over to you, Chief Jones.
Yeah, I mean, so the Chief Jones and agency and my agency, we're integrated in training and in service as well as entry-level training together. So all of my deputies and all of Marcus's police officers go through similar training. Now we do above and beyond when we can, certainly based on resources and time, but implicit bias is one of those trainings that does get done. I will say though, what we've done in the past, whether it's implicit bias, de-escalation, I think that what needs to be done is a review of all of these type of trainings, because it's not that you do a certain type of training, it's how it's balanced within the scope of just about everything that we're training in. So if we do 40 hours of some sort of, firearms training, but only 10 hours of implicit bias, then, is that balanced appropriately? So I think as a reflection of everything, you got to look at this as a holistic approach, and where is time and energy best spent, and what are the best approaches moving forward.
Thank you. Chief Jones, would you like to answer that question?
Yeah, I mean, I would just piggyback on what Sheriff Popkins stated. I mean, I think at the end of the day, you always have to do a reevaluation as times change. There's a greater need for a greater emphasis on the different types of training that occur. For example, even with implicit bias training, to make it a reoccurring training. Again, with our community being very unique in its culture, it's always important for us to look at new ways to expose our officers and to address different cultures, whether it's our racial, ethnic, or religion. There's a lot of things because we're so multicultural here in Montgomery County. There's always the ability for us to make changes. So with that being said, it's, we take that very seriously, and we look for those new opportunities to bring in, but in order to make sure our officers are well engaged in the discussions. And this is not just a checkbox that sometimes folks will get disappointed and really disengaged because they feel like, I've been through this before. Why are you making me go through it again? This is all across different companies, similarly to with cultural diversity, where companies made those mandates on employees. And so not that policing is any different, but we try to encourage our officers and try to bring it in a way that it best fits them because of the unique role that they play in our society.
Okay, thank you. Before we move on to Councilmember Navarro, I'm going to ask one last question of the two of you. There's a question that came in about unarmed law enforcement units and whether either one of you would support having unarmed law enforcement units on the streets.
So, in where we are in law enforcement, when we talk about supporting unarmed law enforcement officers, because of the responsibilities that law enforcement officers have, and an expectation in our communities about what is their role, I think that's a very difficult situation to put any individual in, depending upon the situation, that an officer does not have the protection. And it's not just for that officer, but it's the protection of the community, because at the end of the day, your handgun should be the last tool ever to be utilized in most situations. Now there are situations that we go into danger knowing that that there's weapon already in that danger, and therefore we have to have that tool necessary. But again, and this is a dangerous job, and I know most individuals, we look at television, and we have these different expectations of law enforcement about what are our capabilities. But this is reality. We live in a society that sometimes it's not as it can be dangerous in different situations that our officers are confronted with each day, that many times the community doesn't even know anything about. It's not a media related story. We don't share every story of these types of cases. So I think that's a very difficult thing based upon what are the expectations here in the United States.
Okay, thank you. Let's move on to Councilmember Navarro. Councilmember Navarro has represented District 4 since 2009, where she has twice served as the council president. She chairs the Government Operations and Fiscal Policy Committee and serves on the Education and Culture Committee. Nancy is the first Latina member of the council. She's the author of landmark legislation such as the Racial Equity and Social Justice Act, the Community Policing Act, and has spearheaded groundbreaking work by authoring the framework for the county's early care and education initiative and the county's economic development strategy. 2011, President Obama appointed Nancy to the President's Commission on Educational Excellence for Hispanics, where she served on the Early Childhood Education Committee. Prior to joining the council, Nancy was a member of the Montgomery County Board of Education. Before entering public office, she co-founded a nonprofit community-based organization with a mission to assist the economic and educational development of Latino and other immigrant communities. Nancy graduated with a bachelor's degree in psychology from the University of Missouri in Columbia. She was born in Caracas, Venezuela, and has lived in Montgomery County for more than 2 decades with her family. Councilmember Navarro, over to you. Okay, so we will come back to Councilmember Navarro. So Will Jawanda was elected to an at-large seat on the County Council in 2018. He's been actively using his platform to push for racial equity, social justice, and expanded opportunities for all residents. His first piece of legislation, the Law Enforcement Trust and Transparency Act, mandates an independent investigation and a full report in cases where when a Montgomery County resident loses their life at the hands of a police officer. Just this week, he introduced a resolution to declare racism as a public health emergency, and in the weeks to come, he intends to introduce additional legislation on police use of force. Councilmember Durando grew up in the Long Branch community of Silver Spring. He attended NCPS for elementary and middle schools before attending St. John's College High School on a scholarship. He went on to attend Catholic University in Washington, D.C. for college and law school, forming the first NAACP chapter on campus. After graduation, he went to work on Capitol Hill for Speaker Nancy Pelosi, Senator Sherrod Brown, and then Senator Barack Obama, before going on to work in the Obama White House and the Department of Education. He lives in Colesville with his wife and 4 children. Councilmember Jawanda, over to you, sir.
I'm doing well. Thank you so much for Paul for putting this on, and for the Communities United Against Hate, all the work you all do throughout the community, particularly with the nonprofit that I co-founded with John Randall, rest in peace. Our Voices Matter. So thanks for all that you guys do. It's good to be with the Attorney General and Mr. Frost. Good to see you. Good to see Chief Jones and Sheriff Popkin, and Ms. Roth. Good to be on with you as well. And my colleague, Councilmember Navarro, hopefully will be back soon. So, let me try to frame and step back a little bit. Obviously, this has been a difficult couple of weeks for the country, for the world, really, but particularly for our country. And here in Maryland and Montgomery County, we've had to watch the brutal murder of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and so many others. Here locally, Fanon Burhay. We just commemorated the 2nd year anniversary, not really an anniversary, but 2nd year since Robert White, a black man, unarmed black man, was killed in Silver Spring, walking and doing a walk that he normally had done hundreds of times before. So we've had our own cases here of police being involved in the death of residents, and black residents and black men. And it's an epidemic. It's one of the most pernicious forms of institutional racism. If you're a black man in this country, you have a 1 in 1,000 chance of being killed by police. You have the greatest likelihood. And for some ages of young black men, that's one of the leading causes of death. And it's a serious problem. If you watch that 8 minute and 46 seconds, I encourage everyone, every time I speak to somebody about this, I encourage everyone to take that time in silent reflection and feel not even an iota of the pain that George Floyd and those witnesses must have thought while he was being dehumanized and killed right before our eyes. So I understand deeply. I'm one of the 2 black men. If you have 2 black men standing next to each other of a certain age, 1 or 2 of them have been arrested. If you have 3 standing next to each other, 1 of the 3 have spent time in jail or prison. And it's a sad fact that that's where we are right now. And it finds its roots in institutional racism, as has been mentioned. 401 years ago, the first enslaved Africans documented arrived on these shores. And since that time, for 86% of the time that black people have been in this country, if you count through 1965, the last major Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act being passed, we've been either enslaved or legally discriminated against by the state. And that is something to think about. And when you think about how entangled this is, if you think about the police force in the South beginning with its origins to round up escaped slaves, and then said by legislators at the time that since now that we have these Black people around, we need the police to keep them in check. And for so long, that was the history and mission of the police. You don't just detangle that with one bill or with one action. And so we're still dealing with that legacy. And in so many other ways, we die due to environmental racism, economic injustice, redlining, being forced to live in communities, healthcare, the list goes on. So that was why we introduced that resolution declaring racism a public health emergency, because it is. You look at COVID, you know that. But in policing, what I think we need to do is we need to reframe completely the goal of public safety. Some people that's been mentioned a little bit in some of the questions. And so what do I mean by that? We need to change the incentive structure. Right now, if you walk in some Montgomery County Police departments, district stations, and I've seen pictures of this, you'll see a board with names of officers, and next to it will be how many arrests and ticket stops and tickets that they've issued and arrests that they've had, and you'll have it ranked, and the lower people will be at the bottom. And while we certainly need to track those things, and there's certainly an indicator and a measure of what we're doing, that shouldn't be the primary focus. When I worked on Capitol Hill, we used to talk about the burn justice grants, where you got extra money from federal government if you made more arrests. And when you have that type of incentive structure combined with institutional racism, you're going to get the results that I talked about at the beginning with those very disparate numbers. We need to be focused on protecting and serving, not stats-driven policing. That's a huge issue. We also need accountability. We need de-escalation techniques to be used first. We need to raise the use of force standard. I'm working on a piece of legislation on that. We need to require a duty to intervene by officers when they see an officer committing a crime. And that's a bill I'm working on with Councilmember Navarro and Councilmembers Rice and Albornoz. And I'll end with this because I don't want to take all the time. I will answer questions. I'm assuming we'll do that. The mediocrity is the enemy of progress. In Montgomery County, we are a great county. We have great people. We have a great diverse population, 4 of the top 10 most diverse cities in the country. And we are a good place. I've been here my whole life. I love it. I'm raising my kids here. I'm not going anywhere. But we do ourselves a disservice if we think that what happened in Minneapolis and what's happened around the country cannot happen here. And I'll give you one example as I close. We had an officer in White Oak doing a sting operation for the sale of psychedelic mushrooms. And they got in a tussle, and the suspect was handcuffed and put on the ground. And during that altercation, he was kneed in the head while he was handcuffed, while other officers stood around. Kneed in the head hit the ground concrete, he started bleeding. He was later had a shirt pulled over his head, which could have caused potential suffocation. I said that happened a year ago in July. I've said it before, I'll say it again. If that young man was paralyzed, if that young man was killed, which could have happened if you've seen that video and the level of force was used, we would have been Minneapolis 9 months ago. The officers that stood there and watched while this altercation happened and no one intervened, similar to what happened with George Floyd. And so we cannot think, while we have great officers and we have a good department, you cannot think that that can't happen here. And so I just want to make sure that we act with that same urgency and not let ourselves say, while we're a great place, we also have much work to do. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councilmember Jawando. We're starting to run short on time, so I'm going to just jump right to Councilmember Navarro and then to Ms. Roth from Amnesty. Councilmember Navarro, I'm not sure at what point you dropped off, but I think it was in the middle of my introduction. I hope that everyone else heard the introduction. I think you probably know it pretty well, so I'm going to forgo doing it again and just jump right over to you if that's okay.
Thank you so much, Paul. I'm sorry I had some technical difficulties, but I really want to thank CUAH for the invitation. It's a really important conversation, and I just can speak for myself, but to say that obviously this has been a very difficult time for so many with the combination of COVID-19 and then with this horrific murder of George Floyd. All of this has come together, I believe, to bring up unmanageable concerns, rage, all kinds of feelings. And so we're all dealing with that. And I want to say that because as an elected official, I'm not immune to that rage and that anxiety. So I appreciate this opportunity. Let me say up front, kudos to the young people who have seen in this trauma an opportunity to confront systemic and institutional racism. They have given an urgency to the demand that Black Lives Matter. Mr. Floyd's death will not be in vain. If you're on social media, as many of us are, you know that Montgomery County has had its share of instances of police brutality and widely publicized deaths as a result of police action. 3 deaths come to mind: Emmanuel Okutuga, February 19, 2011, Robert White, June 11, 2018, and just last month, Finan Berhe, May 7th, 2020. This is not acceptable, and as leaders, we owe our residents a warm and welcoming space in which they feel respected and safe above all. The current crisis has been a long time coming. We all knew that if this dysfunction was not adequately addressed, we would be faced with an uprising the kind of which we have not seen in half a century. As a result, over 2 years ago, as a council, we began to invest in systemic efforts to reform the way that we conduct the business of work and life in Montgomery County. In April of 2018, then Councilmember Mark Elridge and I spearheaded a resolution adopted by the full council in which we committed to instituting a racial equity and social justice law. In November 2019, the racial equity and social justice law, which I authored, was unanimously adopted. And under that umbrella, we have had several laws and initiatives focused on confronting racism and bigotry in general, and in particular, police brutality in our country and our county. Training was key to our initiative. We had African American and Latino racial equity workshops for the top leadership of our county, including the police force. As an important first step to address equity, the members of the Racial Equity and Social Justice Committee will be paid a stipend, $2,000 with reimbursement of appropriate business expenses. Our pioneering efforts are being replicated in places like the state of New York, where a similar law on racial equity and social justice is being worked on by the legislature. We are making progress, but we will do more. Here on the council, we await the county executive's accompanying regulation that would outline the implementation strategies and guidelines of the racial equity and social justice law. In the meantime, I am pleased to share that I have asked for an update of the status of the implementation of the law before the Government Operations Committee that I chair. This briefing will be on June 15th, next week. Our committee looks forward to meeting with Ms. Tiffany Ward, Chief Equity Officer, on that day to get clarity on these issues. So please tune in. We have a long way to go. Much of the work has been truncated by the COVID-19 pandemic, but the work will be done, and more than ever, it is of paramount and urgent priority. Under my leadership as president of the County Council in 2019, I'm proud of our work as individual council members and as a team in confronting the issue of police brutality and deaths of residents resulting from police contact. Last year, after a long process, we approved the appointment of Marcus Jones as chief of police, and I was proud to put up my hand to vote for him. He has assured us that he will work with the rest of us in our reform efforts, and we will hold him accountable to that promise. We have since adopted the Law Enforcement Trust and Transparency Act bill, authored by Councilmember Will Jawando, which establishes a body of independent investigators to investigate police-involved deaths. The Community Policing Bill, which I authored, that sets forth expectations for community policing by emphasizing the importance of transparency, accountability, and building, maintaining relationships with members of the community, as well as combating bias and increase cultural competency amongst members of our police force. The Police Advisory Commission, authored by Councilmember Haas-Remer, which will advise the council on policing matters, provide information regarding best practices, and recommend policies, programs, legislation, or regulations. These reforms and initiatives are not only research-based, they have been instituted after robust conversations and meetings with community groups as well as public hearings, after which the feedback was taken into consideration for final bills. We can do this and much more. Just this week, we introduced a resolution that Councilmember Jawando just spoke about, declaring racism as a public health crisis. And as he also mentioned, we're working on another bill regarding the use of force. In closing, let me say that Mr. George Floyd's murder reminds us that this important work cannot wait. After the initial despair, I'm inspired to say to our community that I will continue to work alongside my colleagues to do everything possible to make our county a safe and welcoming place for all. As an unapologetic proud Latina and mother of 2 fierce Afro-Latina young women, I stand with our Black brothers and sisters in this fight. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Councilmember Navarro. I'm going to ask one question that just came in to pick up on sort of your work with that groundbreaking legislation. It concerns the impact of the pandemic, or the disproportionate impact of the pandemic on our Black and Brown communities. Could you speak to what it is that the council is doing, and perhaps Councilmember Joando, you may be able to speak to this as well, what you're doing to address that disproportionate impact?
Thank you for that question. 20904, 20906, 20902, those three zip codes actually are in my district. They also overlap with Councilmember Hooker's district. And of course, it was no surprise because we know that these are the zip codes where the majority of our Black community and our Latino community reside. And what really gave way to the racial equity and social justice law for me was precisely that after so many years of investing and of working to expand initiatives and programs to close many of these disparities, specifically health disparities, we continue to see that trend. And I became convinced that this is why we needed to have a law in place that forced everyone to look at the data every time we make a decision. So here we are with COVID-19, and this has come to the forefront. And it is something that in every single meeting we have with the executive and our health officer and Mr. Starter from the emergency office, we bring this up. What is being done? Everything from making sure that we have GO teams specifically serving those 3 zip codes, everything from making sure that we have food distribution that is targeting those 3 zip codes. We, in our adoption of several special appropriations, specifically looking at food distribution or emergency family cash assistance, in every single special appropriation, there is language that says that we need to make sure that the strategically is going to those zip codes that are more disproportionately affected. We also include language that makes sure that we have multicultural, multilingual communication, because communication has been key. Imagine when you think about, for example, in 20902 and 4, where we have the largest Latino community and a lot of non-English dominant residents in all of these zip codes, information can be the difference between life and death. If you don't know where you can go get tested, if you don't know that you can have access to rental assistance, for example, although there was now a cap on rental increases, there's just so many things that you need to know in real time. And so everything that we have done specifically making sure that we continue to target those zip codes that are most disproportionately affected, including now standing up hubs, which are basically areas where you can get distribution of many of the things like food or diapers and things like that in these particular zip codes. So it's been an all hands on deck, but it continues to be a real concern for me. And again, another major example of why it is that we have to be very aggressive in continuing to strategically target these areas.
Thank you. And Councilmember Joando, you're an at-large member of the council, so everything falls within your jurisdiction. Would you like to share your thoughts on that question?
Sure, yeah, briefly. That was a very comprehensive and answer that I agree with everything that was said by my colleague. And we live in those high impact districts, zip codes, Councilmember Navarro and I, and we know we are segregated. This is much like most of the country. We're segregated socioeconomically, racial, ethnically, and that has, people just think that happened. No, it was legally done that way, and we were only allowed to live in certain places. And so that's why it's so important to tie these things back in a really clear way to racial inequities, because you can't fix a problem if you don't diagnose it. One of the things I will add is we sent a letter as a full council that I worked on to request that the governor is early on in the COVID process give us the data broken down by race and ethnicity and zip code. Also, not only cases, but who's getting tested and where's the access, going along with what Councilmember Navarro is saying, because we knew early on we were going to have these disparities. And we're still concerned about it. You have people disproportionately in denser areas, in apartments, disproportionately frontline workers who are exposing themselves, taking care of the rest of us, whether it's bus drivers and cleaning folks, obviously police and fire. And so those are some of the things we're worrying about. And it continues to be an issue, and it just has exposed the deep inequities that we have to address in a systematic way. And that's why I'm so excited that we're building on that work, the racial equity bill, the resolution that we introduced yesterday, declaring racism a public health emergency, because it really is. We're dying in so many ways, and race is at the root of many of them.
Great, thank you very much. Okay, so we're running to the end of the program a bit, and last but certainly not least, we're very privileged Justice Program at Amnesty International USA. She oversees the organization's work to abolish the death penalty and stop unlawful killings by the police. She serves as Amnesty's expert on these matters and works regularly with grassroots activists, impacted communities, elected officials, and other top stakeholders to put an end to these urgent human rights abuses. She has represented Amnesty before the UN Special Rapporteur on Racism, Racial Discrimination, Xenophobia, and other forms of intolerance, and at the annual Fast and Vigil to abolish the death penalty. Her analysis has appeared in The Guardian, The Washington Post, and various other outlets all over the world. And so Chrissy is going to talk to us about what's happening in Congress and in the state legislature. Ms. Roth.
Thank you so much, Paul. It's an honor to be here with you all tonight and be on this distinguished panel with both law enforcement and elected officials in Montgomery County. I grew up in Fairfax County, so on the other side of the river, but I have love for y'all. I've spent some time living in MoCo. Anyway, so as Paul said, I'm with Amnesty International and I lead our work on state sanctioned killings domestically here in the U.S. We should never believe that our human rights abuses only occur overseas. There's plenty of them happening every day right here in the U.S. of A. And so it's my job to do our work on the federal and state level to abolish death penalty, which y'all have already made great progress on. So kudos on that. Let's make sure it stays that way. And also our work to stop unlawful use of lethal force by police, which really leads me to the moment that we're having right now as a country. And Council Member Jwando mentioned a lot of important facts that I wanted to share as well. So I'll just ditto a lot of those, understanding the time limitations. But I think it's also important to recognize as we're sitting with this moment that the nation is really gripping with a potential real turning point for how we see public safety. You know, certainly the killing of George Floyd was caught on camera, but there are thousands more that happen like it and have been happening like it that we'll never learn the names of those individuals or see a video of how they died. Their loved ones may not even ever know the name of the officer that was accountable for taking their lives. And so I want to acknowledge the work that's been going on in this field for a long time. And so just to give you a bit of an update about how things are taking place in Congress right now, you know, as I mentioned, this is a real turning point, and truly as an advocate that's been invested in the policing issues for some time, we are seeing really bold proposals before Congress, and that doesn't mean we shouldn't push them to be better, but there are some ideas that that you know normally would be really pie in the sky that have been included in some legislation that's being championed by the chair of the Congressional Black Caucus, Karen Bass. She's from Los Angeles, as well as the chair of the House Judiciary Committee, Gerald Nadler. And on the Senate side, we have Senator Cory Booker and Senator Kamala Harris, who are leading that legislation. And so some of the proposals, one of which is certainly a priority for Amnesty International, is the establishment of a national use of force standard. As I said, that particular issue is really in my bailiwick, and Maryland is one of 9 states in the country that doesn't have a use of force law in statute as of now. It sounds like there's enthusiasm to change that, so I feel hopeful about that. That said, the states are really all over the place as far as the use of force laws go and the standards that are applied. And so we think it's incredibly critical in this moment that we take this opportunity to institute a national standard that would apply principally to federal law enforcement, and then using that very same grant program that Councilmember Jwando mentioned, the Burn JAG grants, use that to incentivize states that they instruct them that they need to change their state laws. They need to enact a law in their state statutes to this standard at risk of losing some of those very funding. And so that law for us looks like, it's called the Peace Act, and it's sponsored by Congressman Khanna out of California. The Peace Act would reserve deadly force unless necessary as a last resort in the interest of preserving human life after reasonable options have been exhausted. And it also takes into account that officers should not pose any third-party harm to an individual. This bill is a really big step forward as far as what our laws already look like. There are 9 states where officers are allowed to apply deadly force to suppress a riot. There are very few states that require officers to provide any kind of warning to using deadly force. And I'm by no means saying that is the case in Maryland, that is what happens, but this is what we know to be in fact based on the statutes. So this is one proposal that Congress is considering and was debated today as the House Judiciary held hearings. Another thing that is a huge idea to address really some of the incidents we're seeing are they're looking to ban chokeholds and the particular hold that was applied to Mr. Floyd as well. I'm seeing trends as well around the country of states that are doing that similarly and their various governing capacities of banning the use of chokeholds. That as well is included in the Peace Act as far as what is considered to be deadly force. That is an incident. We also have a bill, there's another proposal to ban the use of no-knock warrants. When we think about the death of Breonna Taylor, the police were in the right place and they had a no-knock warrant, and whether the facts seem to be unclear as to whether or not they knocked or not, but that these particular no-knock warrants are used disproportionately for drug raids, which did have a disproportionate effect on communities of color, whether or not they're particularly helpful at all. Some other things I'll just rattle off real quickly. Some very big ideas that anyone who knows or has been impacted personally by police violence is that qualified immunity equals impunity far too often, is that when a state-based actor is not able to be held accountable for what they have done for deprivation of someone's civil rights. And so this bill looks to end qualified immunity. There are proposals before the floor to do that altogether, as well as changing the standard by which a state-based actor or a police officer could be held liable if they, to make it a little bit easier for them to be prosecuted if they violate someone's civil rights, which we think is obviously a very bold proposal, but something truly worth considering. And I do think, when we think about these big ideas, to the conversation about, there are good and bad officers, and we certainly, need to work with good officers to get better policy, that I think there are many police that can get behind the idea that officers that break the rules and make others look bad, do not need to be serving as police anymore. And some of these policies really look to bring better accountability for when those incidents happen. Another thing I'll name real quick, just knowing that time is very short, is a national registry for police misconduct. That's, I think, an idea that has a lot of bipartisan support right now. Again, to that very same principle I spoke of earlier, the idea that officers who, and particularly in the case of George Floyd, I believe Officer Shipman had something like 6 infractions against him, and could have been prosecuted at an earlier date by a former Hennepin County prosecutor who is now Senator Amy Klobuchar. And this registry would allow police to be able to have that personnel information so that when officers move from different departments, they would know if they had these sort of infractions against them for crimes, particularly looking also at domestic violence and abuse as well. So I know there's a lot of information there and we're running short, so I'm going to leave it there and hand it back to you, Paul.
Wow, thank you very much. I am going to, it's 7:15 right now. What I'd like to be able to do just to close is do one quick round to everyone and ask you, what is your top priority? There's a couple questions have come in about this, but what is your number one priority when it comes to addressing police brutality? Starting with you, starting from the top of the order, Attorney General Frosh.
Sorry. There is legislation pending in Congress, been sponsored by our senators and most of our congressmen in Maryland, that is directed at police reform. I think that's the most important and most likely vehicle for real and significant change. And I'm hopeful that we'll see some action in both houses in the very coming months.
Great, thank you. Chief Jones.
Well, thank you. And I will just say that I think a top priority is to really do a deep dive and review of policies as relates to police brutality, to address that the discipline process is fair and efficient, and that we are able to, again, gain the trust as it relates to our accountability to the community, as it relates to the policies and the discipline that we give to officers who might violate those very policies that the community trusts us with.
Thank you, Sheriff Popkin.
Yeah, Paul, thank you. I would say that as Attorney General Frost said, the number of the barriers to these changes are legislatively driven, and until some changes are made on a statewide level, we won't be able to get to where we need to get. So I would say that's a top priority, and these dialogues that we are having now can't just stop in a couple of weeks. They have to continue until there's actual change.
Thank you, Councilmember Navarro.
Thank you so much. First of all, I would say that most certainly the implementation of the legislations that we have recently adopted, I think that's going to be really important, making sure that we're implementing this at fidelity and providing the appropriate oversight. And in addition, I think the pending legislation or the legislation that will soon be introduced regarding the use of force, and also taking a very close look at the mental health issues. I know the CAHOOTS program, for example, in Oregon is one that has been mentioned a lot as a best practice. And I think that we need to look at that. And we need to definitely, again, continue to ensure that, our police department reflect our community is really important. Diversity of officers, the language capacity, all of that is super important, and de-escalation. So I think we have a nice package, but there is a lot of work to do in making sure that it's implemented appropriately and that we have the proper oversight.
Thank you. Councilmember Jawando.
Yeah, these questions are always tough on panels. What's the one thing, right? You have to push from both sides. I agree. The federal legislation that the Attorney General and others talked about is critical because the incentive structure, but you also have to work at the local level. We have, 19,000 police departments and sheriff's departments around the country, and how those things are implemented at the local level depend on who is the chief, who's the sheriff, which many of these positions are appointed by political folks, and what will be the training and the implementation of any piece of legislation. So, and then the biggest thing, if there was really one thing, reimagine, like what is public safety? What are we valuing? What are we spending time on? Why are we stopping people? What are we promoting based on? What are we tracking? This is a moment, if we just do some policy changes around the edges and we don't ask ourselves that fundamental question, why were we stopping George Floyd for counterfeiting a $20 bill? And why were we doing that in that way? And why were we with Eric Garner for selling a cigarette? And so if we don't ask those questions about why and how we enforce them, what are the laws and how we're enforcing them, then we're doing ourselves a disservice.
Thank you. Finally, Ms. Roth.
Thanks. I do think these federal solutions are worth consideration, and certainly a national use of force standard that included critical words like as a last resort and after exhausting reasonable options is something we should absolutely do at the federal level, and states should consider as well. I'm obviously happy to work with the state of Maryland to do that. But I want to also be careful to prescribe one prescription, just knowing that while I think law and policy play an absolutely critical role, and as well as police departmental policy, we're sitting on top of a 400+ year problem here that just the equality under the law doesn't exist for people that are Black. That's just true. It doesn't exist for me or Will or for Chief Jones. So I think we have to sit with that and what that really means for how we treat each other, what our humanity means, and what that looks like in our laws as well.
Okay, very well said. Thank you all so very much for joining us this evening. Thank you all in the audience for joining us. Really appreciate it. This, to me, has been a tremendously helpful conversation. I just want to remind folks that we'll have Senator Van Hollen during the week of June 22nd, along with State Senator Will Smith and other legislators and activists. And we're looking forward to everyone getting involved, to supporting some of the changes and supporting some of the efforts of these terrific people on this panel. So everyone, enjoy your evening, be safe, and thank you again for joining us. We're taking off now, signing off.